This video was made using insights from vidIQ. Stick around after the video to find out how we used vidIQ as our secret YouTube weapon while making it. Known among US military circles as the King of Battle and in the Russian Army as the God of War, field artillery has historically played a huge role in every major conflict until the 21st century. However, because NATO has been embroiled in fighting the war on terror for the past 20 years, some crucial artillery skills have started to slip. Additionally, with Russia having plenty of tactical experience employing massed artillery in 4 conflicts over the past 20 years, they've learned plenty of lessons. Russia could use these lessons to great effect against their enemies. Because of that, it begs the question of whether Russian artillery could smash NATO forces. As far as raw equipment, as it stands today, the numbers are evenly matched. Though Russia does outclass even the US regarding the sheer number of towed and self-propelled artillery systems. The numbers are practically equal when all of NATO alliances combined, but the main difference is in the quality of the equipment. The US 155mm Paladin and German Panzerhaubitze are both state-of-the-art deadly systems for self-propelled guns. With great mobility, extended ranges, and advanced fire control computers, these are just 2 examples of self-propelled guns that NATO could use to fight against Russia. As for the Russians, they rely heavily on Soviet-era equipment that they continually upgrade to remain relevant. Russia heavily relies on the 2S-19 self-propelled gun as the backbone of its frontline battalion tactical groups. Older models like the 2S-5 and 2S-1 have routinely made their way onto the battlefield due to heavy casualties of Russian forces in Ukraine. Despite receiving upgrades to sensors, radars, fire control computers, and munitions, the chassis on these vehicles are often 30, 40, or 50 years old. Because of this, with limited supply chain support for parts, when these vehicles suffer battle damage or otherwise break down, they have to be written off as a total loss. The situation does look a bit more even when comparing Russia and NATO tube artillery. Both militaries rely on Cold War-era designs and technology even today. While Russia has kept most of these designs because of basic economic necessity due to not having enough money to fund research projects for newer systems, US and NATO countries have kept older tube artillery in their inventories primarily due to a lack of need for newer systems. NATO countries have instead heavily invested in advancing fire control technology, communications, and munitions for their guns. These advances aim to make these guns the most accurate ones in the world. For example, munition types like the Excalibur or Copperhead, guided by GPS and laser guidance, have become a mainstay in NATO arsenals. This focus on precision-guided munitions has increased accuracy, but has dramatically increased cost. The high costs of these rounds, often with a price tag of $80,000 or more per round, have precluded the US and NATO from building large stockpiles of shells. Even though NATO would have a slight edge over Russia due to its precision-guided munitions, a victory over Russia is still not guaranteed. That's because of the way Russia trains and employs its artillery forces. One of the fundamental differences between the 2 ground forces is how artillery is used. In NATO countries, artillery fire is used to support advancing infantry forces. In the Russian army, infantry advances are made to gain advantageous positions for Russian artillery to shoot down onto the enemy. This is because, unlike NATO countries, Russia relies primarily on direct fire operations when employing its towed and self-propelled artillery. Artillery batteries can fire any one of a number of fire missions. There are 5 main categories of fire missions, and these can be further broken down into offensive and defensive operations according to Western doctrine. In NATO militaries, artillery fires tend to be long-range with precision munitions. These kinds of fire missions have several benefits. Firstly, they keep artillery crews out of the range of counter-battery fire. Counter-battery fire is when an enemy targets an adversary's artillery positions to knock them out. The longer ranges also give crews more time to correct their fires, since they're in less physical danger than they were if they were closer to the front lines. However, because these operations rely on precision-guided munitions, their rate of fire is slow and the overall costs are high. The Russian doctrine is the exact opposite of this. The Russians primarily use all their artillery systems in a direct fire role. Direct fire is when a gun crew can see an enemy target with their own eyes. This kind of engagement typically happens from several hundred meters to a few kilometers. Because Russia focuses on direct fires, they keep their artillery very close to the front lines, typically only about 2 to 6 kilometers behind the forward positions. How this works in real life is that artillery crews can get direct feedback straight from frontline troops instead of playing a game of telephone from a forward observer to a fire control center and to the individual battery, like in NATO militaries. Russia has a distinct advantage over NATO armies since NATO countries only teach direct fire as a method of last resort. Russia chooses it as its go-to method and it's quite effective. The Russian affinity for direct fire came from its experience in World War II. Throughout most of the war, Soviet artillery focused on direct fire support. By the war's end, like in the Battle of Berlin, 80% of Soviet artillery fires were being utilized in a direct fire role. NATO gunners would not be ready if asked to perform such tasks. In fact, their equipment would not even allow it most of the time. For example, the US M109A6 and M109A7 Paladin, the mainstay of Western self-propelled guns, do not even have a direct-fire gun sight on their barrel. If crews were forced to perform this task, they would have to sight targets directly down the barrel, which is inaccurate at best. Russian artillery would also have another advantage over NATO: sheer volume. As stated earlier, NATO militaries prefer precision over volume to minimize collateral damage. Russia, of course, does not care about collateral damage. We can see this in the way they order fire missions for their gun crews. In the US Army, gun crews could get orders to suppress, neutralize, or destroy a target. Suppressing fire is not meant to be destructive and encompasses only enough fire to disrupt enemy operations or restrict their movement. A fire mission meant to neutralize an enemy only means about 10% of that force to be destroyed. Destroying a force in US eyes involves taking out 30% of the enemy unit. Russian doctrine takes this to the extreme. In comparison, Russian suppressive fire aims to take out 30% of the enemy force, while annihilation, the Russian equivalent of destruction, aims to eliminate 70 to 90% of an opposing force's personnel. How they accomplish this is through sheer volume. To calculate how much ordnance a fire mission would take, the Russian military created a nomograph that combines variables like caliber, duration, target type, and mission. For an example of what an annihilation fire mission would look like, the nomograph for infantry in the open suggests 600 rounds per 12 guns fired every 15 minutes. Such huge ordnance expenditures are only possible because Russia relies heavily on dummy weapon systems. Why Russia relies on less precision-guided munitions is not necessarily because of not having the capability to produce those systems, but the costs involved. Russia has made limited munitions similar to NATO Excalibur and Copperhead munitions. However, due to the costs, Russia has favored mass-producing artillery projectiles over those munitions. At the cost of $80,000 per round, Russia would have burned $48 million for that one fire mission on infantry in the open. The Russian government simply does not have that money to support that kind of expenditure. However, do not think that Russia does not try to make their dumb munitions smart. The way that Russia makes its artillery rounds smart has been through its proliferation of drones. In NATO countries, it's standard now for just one drone per artillery company, while Russia mandates that each artillery observer gets one. To demonstrate just how many drones Russia has bought over the past decades, from the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 to the war in Donbass in 2014, the Russian drone inventory increased ninefold to almost 2,000 drones. Unlike their Western counterparts, practically all of those drones are unarmed. Most drones bought are commercially available, like the ones Russia bought from Israel. Because the drones Russia uses are cheap, they can blanket the sky no matter how many are shot down. Russian artillery crews are trained quite well in using drones to correct for artillery fire. US and NATO countries have been using drones as a reconnaissance tool for their artillery observers, but do not possess the skill to specifically use drones to adjust their fire as Russian gunners do. Instead, NATO countries rely heavily on GPS to know where they are and where they're shooting. Because of that, this would be another flaw if NATO were to get into a shooting war with Russia. In the days before GPS, gunners would have to be excellent mathematicians. Using various formulas and celestial sights from the stars and sun, they would have to do all the calculations for artillery fire by hand. GPS and fire control computers have all but eliminated these skills from NATO armies. However, even though NATO would be quite disadvantaged in a GPS-denied environment, so would their Russian adversaries. After the fall of the Soviet Union, most of the artillery schools and training grounds became part of the newly founded countries. Because of this, the Russian Artillery Corps faced a brain drain of sorts. Newly commissioned officers lacked the skills required to multitask as platoon commanders, fire control officers, and forward observers like in the Soviet model. It wasn't until rather recently that the Russian military started trusting non-commissioned officers to carry out some of these tasks. US and NATO militaries have routinely relied upon their enlisted personnel to do these tasks for generations, so the West would have a win there. The West would also have a win in encrypted communication. As evidenced by the war in Chechnya and now in Ukraine, Russian units routinely lack even the most basic of secure communications. Unlike in the West, where soldiers can feel confident their communications are secure, Russian soldiers consistently operate in environments where the enemy listens to their every move. Communications were so bad during the Second Chechen War that Chechen rebels would routinely call in fire missions on Russian troop positions using their own artillery. Another disadvantage would be the Russian economy, because due to the mountain of sanctions Russia has been under, they can no longer manufacture their precision-guided munitions. In fact, Russian industry is even having issues with producing dumb munitions. In recent news reports, Russia has had to buy boatloads of artillery shells from North Korea since Russia cannot build its own conventional ordnance at the rate it needs. If NATO and Russia were ever to get into an actual conflict, the arsenal of democracy would far outpace Russian production in munitions. Additionally, even though Russian troops have more experience using drones and the war on terror degraded some skills among NATO gunners, NATO militaries could easily bridge these knowledge gaps due to the professionalism of NATO militaries over Russia. Unlike the mass of untrained and unmotivated Russian conscripts, US and NATO troops are more professional, motivated, and intelligent. If war really were to break out, though it might be a tough few months in the beginning, once the West closes their knowledge gaps and ramps up production of precision munitions, Russian troops would be outgunned on the battlefield. Ever wondered how we decide what to make videos about? We're gonna let you in on a little secret. It's vidIQ. It lets us see exactly how many searches per month a certain keyword gets. More searches means more potential viewers, but of course there's more to it than that. vidIQ also shows you the competition for that keyword. The less competition there is, the more likely that your video will stand out, which means more views for your video. I know it sounds too easy, but it really is. You don't need to have a genius IQ, you need to have vidIQ. But try it for yourself. Get a 30-day trial for only $1 by going to vidiq.com/theinfoshow. Now you need to watch why Russia can't stop US weapons, or have a look at I survived 100 days fighting in World War III, not Minecraft.